Hello and welcome to another video from the only channel that you need to not only survive the current apocalypse but actually enjoy it. And today's video is going to be about one of the single most beautiful passages found in the entire Bible. Not only is the literary style absolutely perfect, but the ideas expressed in these verses make them some of the most encouraging words in all of the Bible. The words that I am about to read will be instantly recognized by nearly everyone who hears them. And although most who are familiar with this passage likely feel that these words are very important, I can promise you that what you are about to learn will be well beyond what you know currently. The things that John chapter 1, verses 1 through 14 were meant to communicate to us have for the most part been hidden from humanity for nearly 2,000 years. The words of John chapter 1, verses 1 through 14 in the King James Version read like this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehend it not. That was the true light, which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. He came into his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name, which were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word was made flesh, and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. It should be obvious to anyone reading these verses that we are being told something about Jesus. In fact, any doubts that anyone might have about the identity of the person being spoken of in these verses can easily be dismissed by simply continuing the reading of the book of John. Everything recorded in John's book is about some aspect of Jesus' life and ministry. For thousands of years, Satan has been struggling to keep the truth hidden from mankind. Obviously, he is aware of the book of John and the wonderful truths written down within its pages. But try as he might to keep mankind from learning truth, the Bible is God's word, and as such has seemingly been subject to his divine protection. That is why we can still read its words thousands of years later. There would be nothing more satisfying to Satan than to make the Bible inaccessible to mankind. That does not mean that Satan has not experienced any success in his campaign to keep mankind in the dark. In fact, the vast majority of God's children earthwide still do not possess their own copies of the Bible, and even those who do often believe that the Bible is too complicated to understand. Many people from a very early age are lied to over and over again about what is in the Bible. When they finally get around to reading it for themselves, they will automatically see confirmation of the things that they are taught in verses completely unrelated to those false teachings. But something that is even more insidious than the policy of teaching lies about the Bible is altering the actual words of the Bible itself in such a way as to support those false teachings. Very early on, this would not have been a problem. Scrolls and books were very difficult to produce when men like Noah, Abraham, and Moses walked the earth. Back then, there were no mechanical devices for mass producing anything, especially books. Each page had to be handwritten on handmade writing material using handmade ink. The amount of physical labor involved in producing scrolls and books would have made it very unlikely that anyone would be willing to insert their own thoughts into those ancient documents. After all, producing a single copy of the Bible could take a person's entire life. What would be the point of spending an entire lifetime producing a single false Bible, knowing that the only people who would ever see it would likely be your children and grandchildren? But at some point, producing scrolls and books became a commercial industry. When Alexander the Great entered Judea in 332 BCE, he replaced much of the existing Jewish government with his own representatives. Eventually, the Greek government would even replace the Hebrew Bible scrolls of the Jews with similar scrolls in Greek. When Jesus was alive, the Greek government had been replaced by Rome. But the common language of the people was still Attic, the language spoken by the Greeks at that time. Those whose job it was to record things in writing were called Grammatteus, Strong's number G1122, which our modern English Bibles translate as scribes. The word has no real religious significance to it other than the fact that it appears in the Bible. It means clerk, or one who records in writing. However, many who engaged in this profession would have been employed by the Greek state under the direction of the Jewish religious authority to produce copies of the scrolls of the Bible as it existed at that time. The most popular version of the Bible in Greek from the time of Jesus is called the Septuagint. At some point, the Greek language was replaced by Latin, the language of the Roman Empire. Eventually, Rome fell to Britain, and Latin was replaced by Old English. As each empire was replaced by the next, the scribes of those empires made alterations. Since those empires were run by men who considered themselves to be gods, they were not as concerned about introducing changes into the Bible as some mere mortal living during the time of Noah, Abraham, or Moses might have been. Shortly after the writing of the book of John, the Roman Empire began to produce Latin versions of the Bible, and theologians began to debate the translation of John chapter 1 and verse 1. Some English versions of the Bible say, "The Word was God." Other English versions of the Bible say, "The Word was a God." The argument over whether Jesus was God's Son or God himself rages on to this day. And as much as I hate religious arguments, I have been dragged into the debate on more than one occasion. Unfortunately, while folks have been kept busy fighting one another over their doctrinal differences, Satan has been busy using the dispute to help conceal what this very special passage is actually about. One of the most significant teachings of the entire Bible has gone completely unnoticed, mostly due to some linguistic trickery involving the translation process. In Attic Greek, the word that is always translated as word is Rhema, Strong's G4487. This ancient word is the only word in the entire Attic language that can be properly translated into our English word, word. As defined by Strong's exhaustive concordance, Rhema means any sound uttered by the human voice that has meaning. The reason that this information is so important is because Rhema is not used anywhere in chapter 1 of John at all. You may be wondering what word the empire chose to translate as word in these verses, because after all, I just read it 4 times, so it must have been translated from something. Rhema is used a couple of pages later at John chapter 3 and verse 34, where it says, "For he whom God hath sent speaketh the words. For God giveth not the Spirit by measure unto him." This is not the only occasion where the word Rhema is used. In total, Rhema appears 70 times in the original language text of the New Testament. The word that appears in the opening verses of the book of John is actually logos, and although the churches have spent the last 2,000 years convincing mankind that the Greek word logos is the same as our English word, that is not the case at all. According to the Random House Unabridged English Dictionary, logos means the rational principle that governs and develops the universe. Logos is where we get our English word logic. If you examine each and every occurrence of the word logos in the New Testament and replace the word that appears there with the word logic, you will find that in each and every verse, logic is a much better choice. All of the verses become easier to understand, more inspirational, and much less like religion. Even John chapter 1 suddenly makes much more logical sense. In the beginning, there was logic has much deeper meaning than in the beginning was the Word. Obviously, John chapter 1 and verse 1 is a direct reference to Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1. The concept of in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth does not conflict with the idea in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth logically. In fact, if we love God and love His Word, the Bible, then the thought was probably already there before we even recognized that it was recorded at John chapter 1 and verse 1. After all, if we study the creation account in its original languages, one of the first things that we notice is that God created the world in a very logical order. In other words, He did not create fish and then create the ocean on the following day. He created the ocean first. Understanding the importance of logic to the Bible narrative would be inspirational to anyone seeking truth. After all, decent human beings have always craved life in a world ruled by logic. Throughout the Bible, logic is always associated with righteousness. Rejection of logic is always associated with wickedness. According to the Bible, the concepts of justice and injustice are associated with logic and the rejection of logic. Logic is always associated with truth, and lies are usually easy to detect because they defy logic. The opposite of the word logical is illogical, and so there should be some ancient Greek word that would be the opposite of that form of the word logos, and in fact there are several. At Luke chapter 5 and verse 22, we are told, when Jesus perceived their thoughts, He answering said unto them, what reason ye in your hearts? In effect, when Jesus perceived their illogical thinking, He answered them, saying, what irrational thing are you thinking? The two words used in this verse, which are based on the word logos, are dialogosame and dialogizamos, Strong's number G1260 and Strong's number G1261. Both words mean basically the same thing as logos, but are usually associated with the logic of civilization as opposed to actual logic. If you attempt to make the concept of the spoken or written language work with this verse, then you will understand that logic entails much more than simple words. Since the first verse of John is so inspirational, I felt that it would be a good idea to translate the entire verse from ancient Attic Greek into modern English in order that those seeking truth can get a better idea of just how wonderful the opening verses of John are. In the beginning there was logic. Logic was with God, and logic was a God. It was with God in the beginning. All things came about through him, and without him nothing has ever come about, nor will anything ever come about. He was in all life, and the life was the light of humanity. And the light shone even in the darkness, and the darkness could not overcome it. There was a human that was sent from God, whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify about the light in order to help everyone to understand the light. He was not the light, but he testified about the light. The true light that enlightens every human was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came about through him, and yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, but his own did not accept him. However, he granted authority to as many as did accept him to be children of God on the basis of his name. This was not brought about through blood sacrifices, nor was it brought about by self-will, nor was it brought about by decree of man, but instead brought about by God. Hence logic became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory of a father's only child, filled with grace and truth. I spent 3 days checking each and every word over and over again to make certain that I was accurately translating the original thoughts of God into the text that I just read. I cannot think of any way to be more precise than what I was just now while rendering John chapter 1 and verse 1 through 14. I used every means at my disposal to ensure the accuracy of this rendering of John's message to mankind. I would love to translate the entire Bible into English, but am certain that I would run out of time before getting through much more than the first few books of the Bible. If you compare the King James Version of these verses to my version, you would be surprised at just how much the two conflict. Obviously, what I said is nothing like what you would ever hear in a church. However, what I just read is as close to the original as you will ever get in modern English. The Greek Empire produced the Septuagint sometime around the 3rd century BCE. The Roman Empire produced the Vulgate around the 4th century AD. The British Empire produced the King James Version in 1611, and although these empires were supposedly enemies when they produced their Greek, Latin, and Old English versions of the Bible, they are for the most part in total agreement with one another, although they are all in conflict with my version as well as the original language versions. A major conflict that exists in the Empire's version of this passage is the choice and positioning of the personal pronouns him and it. In the ancient Greek language, there would have been some very strict rules of grammar that would have been understood by those who spoke the language, and translators would logically be confined to translating according to those rules. But obviously they don't. By running the entire passage together as a single thought, our modern language Bibles misrepresent exactly who the subject of each paragraph is. Verses 1 through 5 are specifically describing the relationship that exists between God and logic. Verses 6 through 9 describe the relationship between John and light. And verses 10 through 14 describe the relationship between Jesus and his Father. The relationship between logic, light, and life is the subject of the entire passage, but calling Jesus the light and logic in the flesh shouldn't lead us down the broad road spoken of at Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. None of civilization's religions will ever lead anyone down the path that is approved by God. Another bit of linguistic trickery incorporated into the Bible by the empire's translators are their improper use of the definite and indefinite articles. Logic is a universal concept. In English, a definite article would be understood. In other words, even though in the Greek language it would be normal to say the logic, in English it is not. Translating the word logos as word would still allow for the insertion of the definite article. In other words, since word is not a universal concept, it would be appropriate to insert a definite article as in the word, making the association between Jesus and logos seem like something more than what it actually is. The universal concept of God would not require a definite article either. In English, when we say God, it is automatically understood that we mean the God. It is unnecessary for English speakers to include the definite article the when speaking of God. In Attic Greek, it is the indefinite article that is understood, meaning that since the original text of John 1:1 does not include any article, the indefinite article must be included in English. In other words, logic was a God, not logic was God. As is always the case, whenever I say something that stands in the face of any of the established doctrinal beliefs of any of Satan's cults, I fully expect that there will be repercussions. If you are some kind of armchair theologian, I think that it is important for me to let you know that there are delete and block buttons on my side of this YouTube video. The idea that may be currently swirling around in your head of spending your afternoon copying and pasting a whole bunch of theological nonsense in the comment section associated with this video might be better spent lighting candles while dressed in some kind of sacred costume, listening to gospel music records, or campaigning for your favorite liberal, conservative, or independent politician. If you are a religious person, I certainly wouldn't suggest that you spend your time engaged in any activity that might be perceived as logical. If you don't want to survive, don't listen to me.